Commander Farsight, otherwise known as Chasseur-Viola Chauvaquais Montier, or Oshova for short, is a renegade warrior of the Tau Empire who leads an independent breakaway faction known as the Farsight Enclaves. At one point in time, Farsight was considered to be one of the Tau Empire's greatest heroes, famed for both his martial prowess and tactical acumen. Indeed, it can even be said that Farsight has literally written a book on how to combat the enemies of the Tau Empire, penning a number of texts describing the battlefield tactics of various alien races and how to counteract them. Perhaps Farsight's greatest achievement in this regard was the compilation of his Mirror Codex, which not only detailed the many combat doctrines of the Imperium's Tactica Imperialis, but also those found within the Codex Astartes, giving the Tau a critical edge over not just the forces of the Astra Militarum, but also the majority of Space Marine chapters. Over the course of his long military career, Farsight would lead the Tau Empire to victory across multiple theatres of war, including those of the Arkanasha War and Damocles' Crusade. However, following the culmination of the Farsight Expedition, a military operation to reclaim those worlds that had been lost to the Imperium during the aforementioned Damocles' Crusade, Farsight had grown incredibly distrustful of the Tau Empire's Ethereal Caste, due to not only his frustration with their general lack of support during the campaign, but also his growing concerns regarding just how exactly the Ethereals were able to control the other castes, believing that their methods went beyond that of simple charisma and wisdom. Not only this, but Farsight would also come to learn of the existence of chaos during the battle for Arthas Moloch, which, in conjunction with his ever-increasing resentment towards the Ethereal Caste, resulted in him beginning to question his very faith in the aun'va, the Tau Empire's philosophical concept of the greater good. Thus, when the Ethereal Supreme aun'va, who had learned that the Ethereals attached to the Farsight expedition had all died upon Arthas Moloch, ordered for Farsight to return home and explain his actions, Farsight, believing that the knowledge he now possessed could result in a schism even greater than that of the Montau or Death Age of Tau prehistory, instead chose to sever all ties with the Tau Empire and go into a self-imposed exile. Farsight would eventually go on to reinforce those worlds that his forces had captured throughout the Damocles Gulf during the Farsight expedition, leading to the formation of an independent Tau society known as the Farsight Enclaves. While Farsight's actions would come to be known throughout the Tau Empire as the Great Treason, Farsight himself would argue that he did not turn his back upon the Empire, and that it was instead the Empire that had turned its back on him. Since then, the Enclaves have become a haven for dissident Tau that seek to escape the oppression of or punishment from the Ethereal Caste, with the Enclaves themselves even going as far as to, barring rare exceptions, forbid the presence of any Ethereals within its borders. But even in spite of their distrust towards the Ethereal Caste, who have effectively deemed them as little more than traitors and renegades, the Farsight Enclaves have nonetheless come to the Empire's aid on multiple occasions, such as during the events of the Second Agrelin Campaign, in where Farsight's forces fought side by side with those of his former ally, Commander Shadowsun, against a massive Imperial retribution force. However, in the aftermath of the conflict, the Ethereal Council ordered for Shadowsun to capture and detain Farsight so that he could answer for his crimes against the Empire, a detail that Shadowsun, out of respect for their past friendship, would secretly leak to Farsight in order to ensure his escape. So seeing as how Farsight still seems to care for the well-being of the Tau race as a whole, regardless of his feelings towards the Ethereal Caste, this leads to an interesting question. Could Farsight ever return to the Tau Empire? While many throughout the Tau Empire believe that Farsight has forsaken them by turning his back upon the aun'va, there are some who believe that his actions are not in and of themselves irredeemable. One such example, as detailed within the novel Elemental Council, is shown with Porvri Orez of the Water Caste, who believe that Farsight's actions, rather than being overt acts of malice or treachery, were merely the result of foolishness and pride, and was convinced that Farsight's past successes had led the renegade commander to believe that he had simply found a newer and arguably better way to serve the aun'va. Not only this, but roughly 200 or so years after Farsight's defection, the Tau Empire would actually attempt to repatriate the renegade commander, in hopes of curbing his ever-growing influence and unifying a now fractured people. To do this, the Ethereal Council would dispatch aun'shi, one of the few Ethereals to have earned the respect of the Enclaves due to his martial prowess and intimate knowledge of the Fire Caste, to attempt to reason with Farsight. However, this particular attempt would ultimately end in failure, as shortly after making planetfall upon Arthas Moloch, aun'shi, as detailed within the novella aun'shi, would find himself captured by a Drukhari raiding party, and was subsequently forced to fight within the gladiatorial arenas of Camorra, where he seemingly remains to this day. But if aun'shi had never been captured by the Drukhari, and actually managed to meet with Farsight to discuss the topic at hand, then given the immense amount of respect that the two are believed to have had for one another, there is a chance, even if only a minute one, that aun'shi could have convinced the renegade to, in essence, return home. But given how open-minded aun'shi himself was said to be, with an intense desire to understand the actions of others, then this could have potentially resulted in the Ethereal coming to see the rationale behind Farsight's actions, and subsequently defect to the Enclaves, although there is no way of knowing for certain. Regardless, whether Farsight would ever be allowed to return to the fold of the Tau Empire is a decision that ultimately falls to not just the Ethereal Caste, but more importantly, the Ethereal Supreme. But it is this specific detail that would appear to make it currently impossible for Farsight, and by extension the Enclaves, to ever rejoin the Tau Empire, despite their earlier attempts at repatriation. When Farsight petitioned the Tau Empire for aid against both the forces of Chaos and a vast Orcish horde in exchange for his unconditional surrender, as shown within the book Arcs of Omen Farsight, the Ethereal Supreme, a holographic simulacrum of the long-dead aun'va, would refuse, stating in no uncertain terms that he believed Farsight's actions to be completely and utterly irredeemable. Not only this, but aun'va would decree that any Tau foolish enough to follow the renegade commander and in turn allow themselves to be deceived by his rhetoric were to be condemned alongside him, much to Farsight's frustration and anger. But should a new Ethereal Supreme ever be appointed, then there is a chance that such an individual could view Farsight in a softer, more sympathetic light when compared to their predecessor, and in turn be open to the idea of forgiving and repatriating not just Farsight himself, but the Farsight Enclaves as a whole. But this then leads into another, equally important question. Would Farsight, or any other member of the Enclaves for that matter, even want to return to the Tau Empire? Given Farsight's own feelings of distrust towards members of the Ethereal Caste, which were no doubt exacerbated by aun'va's decision to rebuke his request for aid and in turn condemn both him and his followers to what seemed to be an inevitable pointless death, it would seem incredibly unlikely for Farsight to even consider entertaining the idea of repatriation at this particular point in time. Realistically though, it would appear that in order for Farsight to ever willingly repatriate, the Tau Empire would need to undergo a complete and total political reformation, one where the Ethereals either surrender a significant portion, if not all of their power and influence to the other castes, or have the truth regarding as to how they are able to so effortlessly manipulate the other Tau into doing their bidding brought to light. However, it seems highly unlikely that such reformations would ever occur willingly, as the very idea of the Ethereal Council choosing to freely surrender their positions of power within the Tau Empire seems questionable at best. Indeed, according to the Tau Empire's own historical records, it was only when the Ethereals finally revealed themselves to the other Tau tribes during the final days of the Mon Tau that the internecine conflicts that had plagued their people for centuries would at last come to an end, allowing the Tau to find peace, unity and purpose by embracing the teachings of the Tau Va. As such, as far as the Ethereal Caste is concerned, their place within Tau society can be seen as, for want of a better term, divinely ordained. But as the old adage goes, those with power fear to lose it. Not only this, But should it ever be brought to light that the Ethereal Caste, instead of simply inspiring loyalty in others through sheer charisma, actually make use of pheromones or even some hitherto unknown psychic means to control and manipulate the other types of Tau into performing actions against their will, then this could potentially lead to not only political unrest, but an eruption of violent schisms that could ultimately end with the total sundering of the Tau Empire, resulting in instances of intraspecific violence on a scale not seen since the days of the Mon Tau, a fate so feared by Farsight that it was ultimately what led to his decision to abandon the Empire in the first place. As such, the very idea of Farsight ever returning to the Tau Empire is, barring exceptional and unforeseen circumstances, one that appears to be all but impossible. But regardless of how he may be viewed now by the citizens of the Tau Empire, Farsight will remain to those who know the truth one of Taukind's greatest heroes, even if he is seemingly destined to remain forever incapable of returning home. What do you think? Leave a comment below, and thanks for watching.